It's no surprise the new dietary guidelines are out, and there's a new category specifically devoted to children from birth through 24 months. And today on the show, my guest is Dr. Sharon Donovan, who was a member of the Dietary Guidelines Committee, specifically chairing the subcommittee on pregnancy and lactation, and also a member of the Birth to 24-Month Committee. So she's on the show today, and we are diving into the dietary guidelines for Americans, specifically focused on our tiniest members of society, babies and young toddlers.
Welcome to the Nourished Child Podcast, a show about childhood nutrition, feeding kids, and dealing with the ups and downs of growing a healthy child. Here's your host, registered dietitian and childhood nutrition expert, Jill Castle.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Nourished Child Podcast. You're listening to episode number 130, and I'm Jill Castle, your host. In case you're new here, I'm a pediatric dietitian, and this show's been around since 2016. We air every 2 weeks, and this is episode number 130. So, we've had a lot of shows under our belt, and all of our shows are about nutrition for children, birth through adolescence. We talk about feeding. We talk about child development. We talk about lots of different things related to raising healthy kids inside and out. If you've been around and you've listened to the show, I sure hope you've gone over to Apple Podcasts and rated or reviewed the show. That helps this show out a lot. It helps it get known to other people who might be looking for resources about kids and feeding them and the nutrition that they need. So if you haven't done that, please head over and do that. It helps us out a lot. You can subscribe to the show as well. That way, that basically means you don't pay anything for that subscription. It just means that you get a download on your device every time I launch or release a new show. So briefly, I'll just chat about what's going on in my personal world, and then we'll get into the interview with Sharon, which I think you'll really enjoy. Personally, many of you know I launched a new website back in June, and it's thenourishedchild.com. And on that website are all my resources for parents and people who want to learn more about child nutrition and feeding. So you'll find blog posts there. I've moved all the podcast episodes over there. So whenever I say this is episode number 130, you can go to thenourishedchild.com/130. 130 means 130. So everything has been moved from jillcastle.com over to thenourished.child.com. You'll also find my e-guides there. My courses and programs are over there as well. I'm trying to consolidate everything in one place and keep the Jill Castle website more about my speaking and consulting and writing and mentoring of other professionals. So in the process of moving things over to the Nourished Child, I've decided to kind of restructure the programs and the trainings that are offered over there. Number one, I was feeling like some of the courses and the programs were out of range for a lot of people that really need them. And so I've changed the pricing structure on my programs, trying to make them more affordable for more families. I've also broken down some of my programs into individual training sessions so that, for example, the Nourished Child Blueprint, you might not need to know how to set up a food system. You might feel like you've got a really good food system going, but you might be struggling with feeding, or you might be baffled by your child's behavior. And so what I've done with that program is broken out the different modules. So you can just buy one module. You don't have to buy the whole program. And that makes it more cost effective, I think, for families as well. There's free information over there, a couple of free video tutorials over there as well. So I'm trying to make things more accessible to more families. And I hope that is something that you find works for you. This is the spring. You're hearing this early March 2021. The spring is always an active speaking season for me, and it's no different this year. So if you're a healthcare professional, you can find me over at Orgain. This mid-March, I'll be speaking there. I'll be speaking to the Nebraska Healthy Kids Summit in early March, and I'll be doing some corporate speaking as well, and also some speaking for the Pediatric Nutrition Practice Group. And I get to speak to my local town schools this spring. So that's in April, but it's always fun to speak locally as well. All right, let's get into this interview today with Sharon. I want to introduce her to you first, and then we'll dive right in. Dr. Sharon Donovan received her BS and PhD in nutrition at the University of California at Davis in 1983 and 1988. She completed her postdoctoral fellowship in pediatric endocrinology at Stanford University School of Medicine and joined the faculty at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. She is an assistant professor of nutrition at that time, and then was promoted to associate and then full professor, and is also serving as the director of the Division of Nutritional Sciences. She is a prolific researcher and has over 200 peer-reviewed publications and book chapters, and she receives grant support from the NIH, the USDA, and the food and pharmaceutical industry. So she's widely recognized as a researcher, and as such, it's no surprise that she was invited to be part of the 2020 Dietary Guidelines for Americans Committee. And she's going to talk with us today about what the committee does and what her role has been. And then she's going to really take us on a practical tour of what those dietary guidelines mean for infants and toddlers and what we can take from them and use with our own children. And if you're a health professional, also how you can implement those in your recommendations. So without further ado, I'm going to switch us over into that interview. Good morning, Sharon, and welcome to the Nourished Child podcast.
Hi, Jill. Thanks for having me on.
I'm delighted to have you here today, and I'm so excited to speak with you about the 2020 Dietary Guidelines, which I know you had a big role in. So before we get going, would you please just introduce yourself to our listeners and talk about a little bit about the role that you had with the 2020 Dietary Guidelines?
Sure. So I'm a PhD RD, and I'm a faculty member at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. My research for the last 30 years has focused on pediatric nutrition broadly. Areas where I work are on particularly bioactive components in human milk and their effects on the infant. A lot of the work in my laboratory right now is focused on the gut microbiome development and how that's interacting with infant immune and cognitive development. We also do some work in the area of picky eating and childhood obesity prevention. So because of that background, I was really honored to be invited to serve on the 2020 Dietary Guidelines because this is the first time that we actually were developing the guidelines for B24, so birth to 2 years, as well as for pregnant and lactating women. So specifically, I chaired the subcommittee for pregnancy and lactation, and I was a member of the B24 committee, which was chaired by Kay Dewey at UC Davis.
Wonderful. So the B to 24, so for the parents who are listening out there, they might be loosely familiar with the dietary guidelines in general. And the B to 24 category is brand new. Can you sort of just give us an overarching description of what the dietary guidelines are, who they're designed for, why they're important, and then we'll dive into the B to 24 category a little bit.
Sure. So dietary guidelines are guidelines that are developed by the government. It is a combination of the USDA as well as what we call HHS, where NIH and the CDC are. And so really the primary function is to be the cornerstone of federal nutrition programs. So you may have heard about WIC or SNAP, food stamps, school lunches. also feeding programs for the elderly. But we also, it's a resource for healthcare providers, and eventually this information trickles down to the consumers. So even individuals and their families can use this information. But really the overarching goal is to provide national guidance with the ultimate goal of helping Americans meet their nutritional requirements, but also to be consuming patterns of food that will have the healthiest outcomes throughout life. And so, again, what's exciting about this version of the guidelines, so they've been issued every 5 years since 1985. So this is an ongoing process. But in 2014, as part of there was a mandate that this version included these 0 to 2 years and the focus on pregnant and lactating women. And so this is for the first time we've really been able to take what we're calling a lifespan approach and understanding that, health begins in utero, and it actually even begins on with the mom's health before she even becomes pregnant. So, I think an overarching message throughout the chapters that I contributed to is that health is throughout our lifespan. So as we think about women getting pregnant and preparing to breastfeed, we really need to be talking to teenage girls about, how to improve their diet and how to be at the healthiest weight possible, because it all just sort of accumulates. And, we know that health during pregnancy, that baby is exposed to that intrauterine environment, which does what we call epigenetics, which basically is telling that infant as it develops what to expect in the outside world. And so we know that if the mom has gestational diabetes, or she's overweight, or she has other complications, or even if she's stressed, that can basically sort of be programming that infant. And so we know that life, again, it's really a continuum. And so we hope that people take away that message.
Yeah, for sure. It is a big cycle, and I think it's all connected. And you make a great point of that. I am curious, though, in 2014, it was mandated that the B to 24 category be added. What caused that to all of a sudden become something that wanted to be added, that the government wanted to add it to the dietary guidelines? And, why wasn't it, I guess, included before?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I know that it was part of the Farm Bill in 2014. So basically the funds were put into place. And I imagine it was due to a lot of lobbying and also this growing appreciation of, what I just talked about, that if we're really thinking about health of Americans, we need to be starting during pregnancy and in early life. One of the things about the guidelines is, even though the evidence that we reviewed for adults, for example, included people that are healthy or people at risk, for cardiovascular disease, diabetes, or obesity, they're not meant to be treatment guidelines, right? They're more public health guidelines. And I think that for a long time, the feeling was, well, the American Academy of Pediatrics and others, do sort of the guidelines for infancy. But one of the things that we can talk about later is that during the process of setting the guidelines, we evaluate the scientific literature, the scientific evidence. What do we know about this? And basically, the American Academy of Pediatrics and the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee were evaluating the same scientific evidence. So one thing that's very nice is that our recommendations, by and large, are quite consistent with what the American Academy of Pediatrics and other international organizations recommend. So I think there's a lot of consistency. There's a few differences, but I don't think that parents should be confused that, oh, well, my pediatrician is saying one thing and the guidelines are saying another.
Right. I'm so glad you said that, because that was going to be my next question. How do you make these guidelines? How do you make these recommendations? And clearly you're diving into the research and really looking at the body of evidence. And I'm sure that also informs the different topics that were included in the B to 24 recommendations. For me personally, I was like, well, I've been saying this stuff for a long time. So I do make a personal effort to stay abreast of the research. And so I was refreshed and happy to see that so much of what we're going to talk about here is stuff that, is out there It's not brand new foreign stuff. We'll talk about sugar for babies, and that might be new stuff. But I personally, I remember the American Heart Association coming out and really being strong and saying no sweets in the first 2 years of life. And I remember feeling like, yes, finally, somebody is standing tall and saying, absolutely not. There's no room in the diet of a very young child for these kinds of foods. So we'll talk about that, but it is a deep dive into the research. It is looking at the overarching themes and trends, right? And you mentioned your own research in the gut microbiome, which this didn't really touch deeply on that. However, I imagine in the next 5 years, that may be part of the conversation in the B-24 guidelines.
Yeah. Yeah, so let me step back and answer the question that you started with in terms of how do we set the guidelines? And there's actually 3 different approaches that go into this. And the first is what we call data analysis. So there was a whole committee that basically did data analysis. So what they're doing is they're doing a deep dive into the government's data that they've collected from surveys. So they publish what we eat in America. And so they can go in and say, okay, what are people currently eating? And really, they did more than 150 analyses in these federal data sets. And the idea is that it gives us a baseline. It also helps us to know, are people following the guidelines? Where are we at? But it also helps us to make realistic, practical, and relevant and achievable. We can't tell people to change their diets too dramatically. So that's okay. So the first is the analysis. And so there was also an analysis of the current health status of the US, like how many people are obese, have diabetes, etc. So that's one part. The second part is what we call the nutrition evidence systematic reviews. And what was new this year is that in response to criticism of the 2015 report, the government, prior to the committee being named, developed the questions. And so this was a several-year iterative process where they came up with the questions that they wanted the committee to address. And these were posted, people could provide feedback. So unlike previous committees where the committees got together and said, well, we want to look at X, Y, and Z, we were given a specific set of questions. And with that, then we worked with the government to do what we call systematic reviews. So we basically had the question, we set our framework, what would be included, what would be excluded, and then we did a search of the literature. So throughout this process, more than 270,000 papers were pulled, and we ended up including 1,500 original articles in what we call 33 systematic reviews. So this was a really scientifically stringent endeavor, and every paper was graded for its evidence. And then based on that, the subcommittees, they determined, can we make a conclusion based on the current evidence? And this could be strong, limited, weak, or no evidence. So that's the second part. And then the third part was what we call food pattern modeling. And this is ultimately what the guidelines go out and say. They do an analysis of how changes in amounts or types of foods or beverages might help people meet their nutrient needs and reduce their chronic disease risk. So, basically the data analysis, the systematic reviews, and then the food pattern modeling. So it's interesting you brought up sugar. There's some evidence linking sugar to childhood obesity, but really our recommendation about avoiding sugar came from the food pattern modeling. And it's for exactly the reason that you said. There is just not room in their diet for sugar because they have high nutrient requirements, but they also don't have high caloric requirements. So, for example, their needs for iron and zinc and vitamin D and these, compared to an adult, their diet needs to be extra rich in these nutrients in order to meet these, what we call micronutrient needs, while not exceeding their total caloric requirements. And part of that is, we don't want to be overfeeding children. We want to be, making sure they don't develop childhood obesity. So as we looked at that, it's like, man, there's just no room. And so, there's some scientific evidence, but really a lot of the basis for that came from the food pattern modeling.
So that practical end of, here are the guidelines, but practically, what does this look like? And as you said, there's just no room. Like
Right.
we can't meet all these high nutrient needs if we're, allowing sugary foods on a daily basis.
Right.
So interesting. Okay. So
Can I just mention that
sure.
this is actually the first time that this food pattern modeling's been done in this age group. It's been part of adults, in previous ones. So we're actually writing up a paper right now that we're going to be publishing, and that will, describe really how stringent this approach was.
So let me ask you this question then. When you're looking at food pattern or eating patterns in that birth to 24 months, what sort of eating patterns were coming up for you guys to look at?
Yeah, well, we started looking at 0 to 6 months, 6 to 12 months, and then 12 to 24 months. And we basically decided that we're not going to establish a food pattern for 0 to 6 because they have a food pattern. It's breastfeeding or infant formula.
Mm-hmm.
And then, we were actually unable to create a food pattern for 6 to 12 months either. And part of that is because we couldn't come up with a pattern, particularly for infants who are receiving a lot of breast milk, that would allow them to meet all their nutrient requirements. And I'll tell you right now, iron was the real limiting factor there, but we were able to still make recommendations. And, we can talk about this later, but what we really noticed is, maybe this is unintended consequences, that we see women in the US, more women are breastfeeding, and they're breastfeeding for a longer period of time. Breast milk is fantastic, but breast milk's low in iron, and it's that way for a reason. But in that second 6 months of life, most babies, term infants, are born with an iron store in their liver that during that first 6 months is mobilized. And the RDA for iron actually during that period is set on the anticipated iron intake from a breastfed infant. But beginning at 6 months, the RDA bumps up. And so when we were looking at comparing that intake versus the RDA, they were falling short. What has for decades been able to fill that gap was iron fortified, rice cereals and infant cereals. But then we're also seeing this trend that a lot of young mothers are moving away from prepared baby foods, in particular the rice cereals. And so we suddenly saw this chasm kind of opening up where longer breastfeeding, which is fantastic. We know that there's many health outcomes in the infant that are tied to longer duration of breastfeeding and more exclusive breastfeeding. But then this movement away from the rice cereals and the fact that we don't routinely screen infants for iron deficiency anymore. So, we think that we're just maybe seeing the tip of the iceberg. So that's why in the report, we did make it very clear that in that second 6 months of life that we really need to make sure that infants are getting good sources of iron as well as zinc. And if you don't want to use an iron fortified cereal, then, meats and other iron-rich foods can be used. But that is clearly something that is part of our data analysis, looking at what are babies actually eating and then running the numbers. We saw, we're really potentially concerned about iron. And iron is a critically important nutrient, not only for anemia, but also for brain development and other functions.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up because, well, first, just to summarize, breastfeeding is amazing, right? Breast milk is amazing, as you said multiple times. But what has happened is the way that we are eating, the way we are feeding our children, the foods that we're choosing, and the methods that we're using are creating this unintended consequence in conjunction with longer duration of breastfeeding.
Right.
Now, I wanted to ask you made me think of iron stores in the brain. I've been reading a little bit of research and seeing some of the evidence around iron in the blood maybe not being the best indicator of iron status because it is such a brain-based, nutrient in those first couple of years of life. Do you know anything about that? I know I'm just kind of made me like nerdy. I'm nerding out on what I've been reading, and I have seen some evidence that perhaps we're moving towards more of those brain iron stores.
Yeah, you've got me in an area where I'm not as familiar with that. We do know from studies with children with iron deficiency that there are definitely impairments, in cognitive areas. And so that's why we've really focused on that. Iron is really essential. Iron, though, is something that's tightly regulated in the body, because if we have a lot of free iron in our blood or in our tissues, it can actually be what we call oxidative and damage tissues. So really everywhere in the body where we have iron, it's bound to something. So it's bound to hemoglobin or transferrin or in tissues. I know, like Michael Georgioff, he's a researcher who's done a lot of work in this area. And I'll have to say I haven't followed up on recent work in terms of, how much iron is actually stored. In muscle, we store iron in myoglobin. But where iron is really important is in its functional capacity, working with enzymes, working in gene expression. And so I'll have to do a little bit more reading about that. But I think it's very important to think about that, iron is, most people think, oh, my child's anemic, they're going to be tired, low energy. But we know that iron does a lot of other things. And particularly in this age group, we're looking at cognitive development.
Right. So then let's segue into some of the guidance in that birth to 24 age range. Particularly, let's go ahead and start with nutrients. You've kind of encapsulated the iron aspect quite nicely. And I think what I understand you saying is that when you're starting solid foods at around 6 months, that the food choice is really important, particularly when we're talking about iron. As you mentioned, fortified cereals or meats are really great sources of iron. What other nutrients should parents be thinking about when they're thinking about those first foods?
Yeah, well, if we look at just the overall kind of 3 key guidelines that came, in that age group, first was in terms of breastfeeding, for the first 6 months exclusively if possible, and then continuing as long as the mom wants. If not breastfeeding, then using an iron fortified infant formula. And then also vitamin D is another nutrient that, is recommended that should be begun from birth in breastfed infants. Again, you can think about formula really contains all of those other nutrients. So typically formula-fed infants don't need additional supplementation. But for the breastfed infants, particularly if you have a baby born in the winter and you're not spending much time outside, then having that vitamin D supplement is important. Mm-hmm. And then again, that juncture, that's 6 months. So in terms of timing of introduction of solid foods, we said about 6 months. And again, this is consistent with what the American Academy of Pediatrics says. And, for a long time we said, breastfeed exclusively for 6 months. And when we look at what the World Health Organization recommends, that's true. But, in many countries, breast milk is the safest source, if you're worried about food safety. In the US, there's been this new emerging evidence about the potential of earlier antigen exposure. So the peanuts were the first, but now there's some emerging evidence with eggs and milk as well, suggesting that actually in infants at risk for allergy, what we recommended for so long, avoid, was probably the wrong evidence. And that was a very nice, very well controlled, what we call a randomized control trial, showed that babies exposed to peanuts earlier actually had a lower incidence of peanut allergy. And by avoiding exposure, like we would push it past a year or 2 years, we actually may have been setting them up for the opposite, to actually be more susceptible. And so that's why we say around 4 to 6 months. For some infants, it's fine to breastfeed exclusively for 6 months. For others, particularly with a family history of allergens, you may want to actually begin around 4 months to start to introduce small amounts. But again, these are really small amounts. We're not talking, a tablespoon of peanut butter. And if parents have, a family history of food allergy, the baby's father, other children, then this is something they should definitely talk to their pediatrician about, because there's been a 180 shift in the last few years in terms of what we think about food allergies and prevention of food allergies. Once that infant is diagnosed with a food allergy and actually has it, then yes, you would want to avoid because you don't want to trigger that. But the idea is prevention and treatment are two different phases of an allergy.
Kids change a lot. Their nutrition needs, eating habits, and food preferences do too. So much so, it can be hard to keep up. The Nourished Child, a website designed for parents who want more nutrition education, helps parents like you get crystal clear on raising good eaters. We've cracked the code on nourishing the whole child, whether you're raising a baby, a teen, or a child with health concerns. Our nutrition school and parent education programs help you get the inside scoop on food and nutrients, positive food parenting, and building self-motivated, autonomous kids who are good eaters. Visit thenourishedchild.com today. Great. So starting solids at around 6 months. If you have a food allergen, family history of food allergies, perhaps even starting with those allergen foods as early as 4 months. Again, consult with your pediatrician. You mentioned vitamin D, and I'll just add on here that most infants who are born in a hospital or born, in a birthing center or even an at-home birth, the recommendation is to start vitamin D right away within the first couple of days of life. I can't tell you the number of clients I've had that have never had their young children on vitamin D. So that I'm offering a public service here by announcing, please make sure your babies are on vitamin D. And let's talk about some of the other areas of guidance. I know there was some information around flavor and feeding. Let's dive into that a little bit. Let's talk about flavor, because that's really a more recent emerging area of evidence, I think.
What I would like to do later is come back to, we talked about the food patterns. And so I said, 0 to 6 is breastfeeding, 6 to 12, we didn't actually recommend a pattern, but we had some recommendations about feeding. But from 12 to 24 months, we were able to recommend patterns. But I know we're going to
go ahead and dive into that. We can we'll do that now, and then we'll scoot back to the flavor stuff.
Sure. Because I think all of that kind of weaves in together. So then we looked at infants from that 12 to 24 months of age. And as part of the dietary guidelines, they actually recommend 3 potential dietary patterns. One is what we call the healthy US. The other is healthy Mediterranean. So it's similar to the healthy US, but it has less dairy and more fruits and vegetables and seafood. And the third is a healthy vegetarian. So for 12 to 24 months, patterns were established for the healthy US and the healthy vegetarian. So there's 3 patterns for above 2 and 2 for 12 to 24. And they basically are, in the guidelines, they have different calorie levels. And what I would actually recommend is go to the dietaryguidelines.gov website. And they have some great resources where you can calculate, like for yourself, you can go in and based on the My Plate, you can plug in, your height, your weight, your age, how much physical activity you do. And then it will give you like caloric ranges. And then if you click on that, it can show you the intake of foods. And it does have this down to 2 years of age for children. But, what I would really recommend is the thing that I think was unique about this set of guidelines is that from the day it was launched, December 29th, those resources were already available on the website. Whereas in past years, it sometimes took, several months or a while for the sort of public education information to follow. But that's all available. There's even apps you can put on your phone. So if you're wanting to, see how you're doing in terms of your guidelines and caloric. So if you go and say, okay, I can eat 1,800 calories, it'll tell you, okay, this many servings of fruit, this many servings of vegetables, and then you can click and see, well, what's a serving, et cetera, et cetera. So so there's a lot of resources. I know we're focused on little kids and babies, but, we eat as families, right? And parents are role modeling. And so, I think that as we think about how to feed our children, we need to think about how to feed ourselves as well.
Sure.
So basically what I wanted to segue into is, I know you had a question about plant-based foods and vegetarian diets. And so really the recommendation is that, after a year of age, that you can follow this healthy vegetarian food pattern. And that is based, though, on a lacto-ovo pattern. So again, the dietary guidelines are trying to meet nutrient requirements with food alone, in most cases. And, pregnant women may need iron supplementation, et cetera. And what we found is vegan diets, it's really impossible to meet the nutrient needs of, small infants and children on a totally vegan diet. Nutrients, as you can imagine, would be iron and zinc, also B12, being only in animal products, vitamin D, some of the N3 polyunsaturated fatty acids that we oftentimes see in fish and seafood. So what we said is we can recommend a pattern that is vegetarian but still has dairy and egg in it, which will meet the requirements without the need for extra supplementation. Although I think, we can't think about babies as little adults. And while a vegan pattern may be quite healthy, studies have shown for adults with lower risk of chronic diseases, these are rapidly growing and developing infants. And we want to make sure at this critical first 1,000 days of development that we're meeting those nutrient needs. So we do recommend that if a parent wants to make that choice, that they work with their doctor, they maybe even work with a dietitian who focuses in pediatric nutrition. And definitely that child will need some extra supplementation. And, I always think that babies have little tummies. And when you're feeding them a vegetable-based diet, that oftentimes is quite bulky. And you may fill them up, which is great for us as adults for weight management, but it's not great for babies trying to meet their energy requirements. So again, the diet included like 3 eggs a week, dairy, and in some cases you can replace dairy with a plant-based milk, but you just need to be careful. It's one that has sufficient protein. Something like rice milk, is a gram of protein. And we've actually seen babies with failure to thrive because the moms were feeding rice milk and didn't realize that, they were only getting a gram of protein and, versus 8 grams that you would get in a glass of milk.
Right.
You could do it, but you need to be careful and you need to really be thinking about, meeting your baby's needs.
Right. So is it, I'm thinking of it from a practical standpoint, if a family was vegan and they wanted to stay vegan and they have this newborn baby, is the recommendation to encourage them to be vegetarian for the first couple of years and then transition to vegan? Or is the recommendation really, if you're really strong in wanting to pursue this vegan diet for your infant, that you really do need to hook up with a pediatric dietitian who's qualified and well-versed in the nutrient needs of an infant that young and the supplementation that would need to happen?
Yeah.
Okay.
And this may be a little different because American Academy of Pediatrics actually says that a vegan diet can begin from birth and, using a soy formula and then transitioning. And yes, it can be done, but it can't really be done without supplementation. And also, while a vegan diet may be the choice that you're having, you may just need to decide, okay, my baby's needs are different than mine. And so maybe in the first 2 years, we're going to, provide some eggs. Again, they might choose to use an almond milk or a cashew milk or something like that, but it needs to make sure that, it's calcium fortified and has enough protein in it. But again, we want to model for our children, but we also want to be cognizant of their unique nutritional needs.
All right. What about some of the recommendations around flavor and feeding?
Yeah. Well, this was actually, so prior to this launch of the dietary guidelines, there was a project called the B24 because it was basically the government's way of kind of getting themselves primed for this exercise. So they brought together a bunch of experts and I was part of the initial phase where we said, okay, what are the questions? What do we actually have evidence for? What's a research area? And from that, there was a very nice publication that came out. And this is a lot of the work that's been spearheaded by people like Julie Manella, Susan Johnson, previously by Leanne Birch, probably, one of our founding mothers in pediatric nutrition. And what a lot of Julie's studies have shown that even in utero, because babies swallow amniotic fluid, and our amniotic fluid becomes flavored by the foods that we eat. And so if you think about that, this is almost a way, again, of that baby becoming culturally appropriate in terms of, from a parents are Thai and they're eating lots of spicy foods, that, that's flavoring the amniotic fluid. That also flavors the breast milk. And so, when an infant is breastfeeding and in utero, they're being exposed to different flavors. And during breastfeeding, they're also being exposed to different textures, because we know that milk composition changes over the course of lactation, changes within a single feeding, quite watery in the beginning and then higher fat towards that as the breast empties, versus formula, really, because again, by law, formula needs to be the same day in, day out. And it's also quite homogeneous. It has things that keep it in solution. So that infant's flavor as well as sort of sensory textural exposure is quite different. And so we know that these early flavor exposures are already setting that child up. And then as we transition to solid foods or complementary foods, we want to carry through that, the average American eats like 4, 5 types of fruits and vegetables, or, apples, bananas, green beans, maybe broccoli. A lot of people go out a little bit farther, but what we want to do when that infant is transitioning is to give them lots of different flavor exposures. And, I know a lot of people are moving away from prepared, jarred baby foods, but, one of the advantages of that is that within a single day, your baby can see peaches and pears and bananas and kale and applesauce, whereas you yourself may not be eating that many fruits and vegetables. And so we know that that exposure is helpful. They're going to become picky eaters anyhow. They're going to hit 2 to 3 and you're going to see them reducing those food choices, but that early exposure is really important. And like I said, Julie Manella has done a lot of work on that. And she's even shown that, for example, babies who get soy formula, or what we call our hydrolyzed formulas, which are used for babies with allergies, those tend to be a little bit more bitter. And babies who get those formulas are actually more accepting of vegetables, even more than the breastfed infants. So their tastes and their preferences are all being established during this period. And we think about it as being still a fairly malleable phase, so it's a lot easier to sort of train your baby than it is to train your 2 or 3-year-old.
Right. Or even your school-age child.
Yeah.
I think
or your husband.
Exactly. I think the flavor introduction piece is so exciting and interesting. And I just feel like there's so much growth potential for parents in that area. I'm so glad that the dietary guidelines addressed that, because I think it's, it really changes the game when you're a parent with a new baby and you're thinking about how can I really impact the health of this child down the road. And of course, the foods you choose and the nutrients you provide, but the flavors that you introduce your baby to also impacts what they choose to eat later on in life, what they end up liking and are willing to eat. So it's a really interesting area. So to piggyback on that, what about the sweets and the sugar?
Yeah, so again, the sweets and the sugar, our recommendation really is not needed and actually shouldn't be added before 2 years of age. And that really came, certainly in that first year, with the introduction of complementary foods. I mean, a lot of this is kind of added sugar. So remember, if you're feeding your child fruits, there'll be natural sugar, there'll be fructose. If you're feeding them milk, just like in the breast milk or formula, there's going to be lactose. So or a yogurt, there'll be some lactose. So what we're really concerned about is the added sugar, because it's just bringing calories. We know it brings flavor, but we can also be training our infants, going back to the flavor, to prefer foods that are not quite so sweet and not quite so salty. I always say we're like, fighting this battle, because infants are born with an innate preference for sweet, and breast milk is twice as sweet as cow's milk. It's 7% lactose versus about 4.5%. So think about, milk tastes pretty sweet. Think about breast milk being almost twice as sweet. And we know that babies from birth, if you squirt sugar in their mouth, they smile. Also salt. And I always think when I teach my students is like, if you think about during evolution, sugar, salt, and fat were very rare commodities. If you weren't close to an ocean, there wasn't much salt. Maybe you could get honey or some fruits. And then fat, if you were a hunter or if you were doing more gathering than hunting, you're not going to have a lot of fat. So it's sort of hardwired into us to want these. And now we're basically drowning in a sea of these. And so what we need to do is we need to be like, I would say, like, we're fighting Mother Nature. And the food companies understand this is what we like, but we can also work on our children, and that's maybe not a best way. We can help them to develop preferences so that all of us have probably done this at some point. Like, you might move to a lower sodium soup, or you go from 2% milk to skim milk. And then when you taste 2%, it tastes like cream. So even as adults, we can retrain our acceptability. And now, like, if you've cut your salt, when you taste something regular salt level, it's just really salty. So getting back to your flavors, by not adding this, we're also getting them to appreciate the natural sweetness of natural foods. And then in that 12 to 24, there was about 3 grams of sugar that was part of like cookies and biscuits that was in there, but it was still this recommendation of there's still not a lot of room for that. And again, a bigger picture was childhood obesity. And if you want to add foods that are high in added sugar, and still meet their nutrient needs, you're going to be exceeding their caloric intake, because there's just no way when you run the numbers, that you can stay within those caloric caps that are recommended. So, it's all kind of tied together. It's tied together with flavor, with calories, with healthy weight trajectories. And so really, I think that's where with the guidelines, we were, trying to kind of provide broad guidelines, but also highlight some specific areas where we really feel like the government, we're healthcare providers, and we're parents, can start to think about better ways to start kids off on the right foot nutritionally.
Right. Quickly, has there been any backlash on the guidance for B to 24 months?
The only thing that we heard was really this added sugar, but in general, there was a backlash about the sugar recommendations. You may recall that the committee, in our advisory committee report, recommended reducing sugar from 10% of added calories to 6% in adults. And then the final guidelines actually stayed at the 10%. And that 6% came from food pattern modeling. And, so they looked at, well, maybe we don't have any clinical studies that show that if you feed people 6% versus 10%, you're going to see big differences in health outcomes. But it really came down to, if we don't want people to be eating too many calories, and we look at the way they're eating now, if you want to be able to have extra calories from saturated fat, alcohol, you really can't have more than 6% of your calories from sugar. And actually, that's the same as the 2015 report said. So we're hoping maybe in the next iteration, the guidelines say we need more research. This should spur research in the next few years so that we can really, so I think it's a message that the recommendations are evidence-based, and we're not making recommendations that there isn't evidence from one of these 3 sources that we talked about. But, in general, I would say that's probably been the biggest pushback, because parents are like, well, how can I not, have my child get any sugar? And the thing is, like, yes, there will be birthdays, there'll be, special occasions, but we can still think about, sodas, regular soda, any soda has no room in a child's diet. Cookies and candies every day, I think, go back to using them as a treat. We all don't have to be, 100% every day, but we can't also have a pattern where we're consistently having a high amount of added sugar. And we know there wasn't this good evidence in this age, but in adults right now, we're eating about 13% of our calories as added sugar. So, our recommendation as the advisory committee was to about cut that in half. But, that 13% has dropped from 15%. So we're making changes. And also the food companies, they'll see, they don't want to have to put on their label, that they're providing 25% of your added sugar in a day. So they continue to reformulate. So that's another use of the guidelines, not only for public health, but it also, I think, helps the food companies think about how to shape their products to be consistent with these guidelines.
Right. I think what else can help can be helpful with parents is when they start to understand how flavor does develop. It makes sense to watch how much. It doesn't mean you take all the sugar out, but it does make sense to pay attention because oftentimes we're unknowingly reinforcing those sweet preferences and, those stick with you. I can tell you so many adults are like, I love sweets. I had a lot when I was a kid. I can't break that, desire. All right. Well, Sharon, it has been so great to talk with you about this. Is there anything else you want parents or professionals who listen to know about the DGA for Beta 24?
I think we've hit on the high points. Basically, you don't have to be perfect, right?
Yeah.
And what we're trying to do, and this is what I know you and I both dedicated our careers to, is to help to give parents tools and to answer questions and understand that, these are guidelines and these are what we think is best based on the scientific evidence, but scientific evidence, will change and hopefully in the next version we'll have even stronger evidence. But I think in general, in the US, we eat too many foods that are processed. And that is really where sugar and salt come into our diets. And so as much as we can to move back to whole foods, using an apple versus applesauce, making your own things at home. I think about like a cereal. If you could have a breakfast cereal and then add your own sugar in a smaller amount versus buying a sugar sweetened cereal. So it's where most of the salt in our diet comes from processed foods, not what we add at the table. So making a decision to, I'm always going to buy reduced or no sodium foods, and then I can control how much salt I add. And when I had a good friend of mine who's a dietitian, and when she had her son, we were talking about this, and she was tasting her son's food, and she said, "Wow, it's a lot better when I add a little salt to it." And I was like, "No, it's not for you. It's for your child." And you're not eating to your preference. So some of the things we taste for babies may seem bland, but their sense of taste is also much more acute.
Right.
So model good behaviors for yourself. It's going to help the whole family's health, but also understand that babies are not little adults, and the recommendations and the foods provided to them are there for their specific needs during this time. And the last thing is, you might think you got all figured out with number 1, and then number 2 comes along and it's all out the window.
Or number 4.
Yeah. Or 7. Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, thank you so much, Sharon. This has been great to talk to you. And I know that parents out there will really appreciate so many of the things that you were able to share today. Where can people reach you if they want to connect with you?
Yeah, I'm really easy to find on the internet. I'm at the University of Illinois, so you can actually just Google Sharon Donovan, University of Illinois, or my email is sdonovan@illinois.edu. And I'm always happy to take questions, and in many cases, I can refer you to an expert who, works with parents every day.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sharon.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. Thanks for having me on.
Well, there you have it, folks. I hope you enjoyed that interview with Dr. Donovan. She's very well spoken, related to how the dietary guidelines fit in as a public health recommendation and how we can translate those into our day-to-day living. So if you're interested in more information around infants and nutrition and the dietary guidelines, I have a couple of other episodes here on The Nourished Child that you might be interested in listening to. The recent one with Dr. Perry Klass was episode number 129, and we talked about her book, A Good Time to Be Born. And that's really a historical tour of child health and medicine. Very fascinating. I encourage you to listen into that. Episode number 121, which is the episode where I interviewed Kelly Hawthorne, and we talked about early childhood nutrition. Some of that overlaps with today's podcast. So again, I think you'll find it to be very enlightening. And then last, episode number 120 with Elizabeth Ward, who talked about how to have a healthy pregnancy. And obviously, a healthy pregnancy ties into a healthy baby. So again, a good related episode to tune into if you want to learn more. Also, my book, The Smart Mom's Guide to Starting Solids, is a great tie-in to this episode as well. Many of the guidelines that we talked about today are written in practical format in that very quick and easy book to read for parents. And then last, again, if you enjoyed the show, if you like what you're hearing, let us know. Rate and review the show over on Apple Podcasts, subscribe to the show, and don't hesitate to send me an email if you have a topic idea that you'd like us to address here. As always, I hope that you are enjoying the experience of feeding your children, and I hope that you give that child in your life a loving squeeze today. Talk with you next time. Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Nourished Child Podcast, where the #1 goal is to help you grow a nourished child inside and out.